Daisy was determined to have the final say. She wanted to win the argument, to drive her point home without realizing the weight of her words. And then she said it. "You argue too much for a man. No wonder you're so small down there." The moment the words left her lips, the energy in the room shifted. The tension that had built up over the course of their argument didn't explode. It collapsed into silence. Raymond didn't respond with anger. He didn't throw back an insult. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood there, frozen in place, his jaw tightened, his hands clenched slightly, and his eyes darkened with something deeper than fury. It was hurt, it was humiliation, it was a wound she had unknowingly ripped open. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Daisy stood still, expecting him to return, to shout, to argue, to fight back the way he always did, but he never did. And that silence, that unbearable stillness, was worse than any response he could have given. Most couples argue, there's shouting, maybe some storming off, but at some point they find their way back to each other. That's how it had always been between Daisy and Raymond. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but their conflicts had a rhythm, a push and pull that always ended with some form of reconciliation. But this time was different. That night, Raymond never came back to their bedroom. At first, Daisy thought he just needed space, that he was cooling off. Maybe he would slip into bed later after she was asleep. Maybe by morning things would feel normal again. But when she reached for him the next day, his side of the bed was still untouched. A sense of unease crept into her chest. This wasn't like him. No matter how bad their fights had been in the past, he had always been there, even if only in body. She climbed out of bed and searched the house, expecting to find him in the kitchen or on the couch. Instead, she found him in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, still withdrawn. He wasn't sulking, he wasn't fuming, he wasn't doing anything at all. He just sat there empty. Daisy hesitated in the doorway, waiting for him to say something, but he remained silent. So she spoke first. "Raymond." "Nothing. Why are you sleeping in here?" "Still nothing." She pressed further, asking if he was still angry, if he was coming back to bed, but he barely looked at her. When he finally did speak, it wasn't in anger, nor was it a plea for her to understand how much she had hurt him. It was just quiet, a silence so heavy that it spoke louder than words ever could. Days passed and nothing changed. At first Daisy convinced herself that he just needed time, that he would move past it, that things would go back to the way they were. But they didn't. Raymond withdrew from her completely. If she entered a room, he left. If she tried to start a conversation, he barely acknowledged her. If she reached out to touch him, he pulled away. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something final. It was as though he had removed her from his world without even saying a word. Desperate to fix things, Daisy tried to reach him in the only way she knew how. She cooked his favorite meals, hoping the familiar warmth of home-cooked food would soften him, but he barely touched his plate. She made small gestures, leaving notes, offering small apologies in the form of actions rather than words, but nothing seemed to reach him. And for the first time, Daisy realized this wasn't just another fight. This was something else entirely, something breaking, and she had no idea how to put it back together. He barely touched his food. She tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but he didn't even crack a smile. She reached for his hand, let her fingers brush against his as they passed each other, but he stiffened at her touch. Nothing worked. That's when she realized something chilling. For years she believed that arguing meant there was still something worth fighting for, that as long as they were shouting they still cared. But now the silence between them felt heavier than any screaming match. It was emptiness, and that emptiness felt like something between them had already died. Daisy hadn't realized that her words didn't just sting in the moment. They had reopened an old wound, one Raymond had spent his whole life trying to forget. Raymond had always been self-conscious about his size, but it wasn't something he talked about, not even with his closest friends. Growing up, he had been teased, ridiculed, whispered about behind his back. In high school, a rumor spread about him. Something false that started from a careless locker room conversation but took on a life of its own. He could still see the look on the face of the girl he had a crush on when she heard it. Not anger, not pity, just indifference, as if he had ceased to exist in her eyes. That moment followed him into adulthood. No matter how much he tried to bury it, the insecurity lingered beneath the surface. His last serious relationship had ended in the worst way. He had walked in on his girlfriend with someone else, and when he demanded to know why, she hadn't cried, hadn't begged. She had simply shrugged and delivered the cruelest truth. "You just don't satisfy me." That was the moment that broke him. From then on, he locked his pain away, never letting anyone get close enough to see it. He built up his confidence, convinced himself he had moved past it. And then he met Daisy. She was different. With her he didn't feel small. He didn't feel like he had to prove himself. He felt safe, loved. He believed she saw him for who he truly was. He thought he had finally left the past behind, until that night. "You argue so much for someone who's barely a man. No wonder you're so tiny down there." One sentence. That was all it took to unravel everything. It sent him hurtling back to the laughter in the hallways, the betrayal, the shame. But this time it wasn't coming from a stranger or an unfaithful ex. It was coming from Daisy, the one person he thought would never say something like that. For the first time in their marriage, he wasn't sure he could ever look at her the same way again. Daisy had hoped things would return to normal with time, but the more she waited, the more distant he became. One evening, determined to fix things, she went into the guest room where he had been staying. Expecting to find him scrolling through his phone, she instead found the room empty. The shower was running. His phone lay on the bed, its screen still lit. She hesitated. She had never been the type to invade his privacy, but then her eyes caught an email notification. Subject: regarding divorce proceedings. Her breath hitched. Divorce. No, this had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. But deep down she knew the truth. This wasn't just about that one night. This wasn't about a single cruel remark. Raymond wasn't just angry. He was planning to leave her. When he stepped out of the bathroom, she was already waiting, her heart hammering. "Are you really thinking about divorcing me over one argument?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in weeks, he looked at her. But there was no anger in his eyes, not even sadness, just nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "You think this is just about that night?" That was the moment she understood. It wasn't just the insult. It was everything. The unresolved fights, the growing distance, the wounds they had ignored for too long. That night had been the final blow, but their foundation had already been cracking. Desperate, Daisy did everything she could to make amends. She apologized over and over, not just with words but with actions. She cooked his favorite meals, left him small notes, tried to draw him into conversation about anything. His day, the weather, their memories. But his responses were always the same. Brief, empty. And that was the most terrifying part. She could feel that he already knew the answer to the question she was too afraid to ask, whether he still wanted to stay, and his silence told her everything. Daisy had always believed that regret was something you could fix, that as long as you were willing to try, any mistake could be undone. But this was different. This was the kind of wound that no apology could erase. Then one evening, she walked past the guest room and stopped in her tracks. Raymond was packing. A suitcase lay open on the bed, his clothes neatly folded inside. Panic surged through her, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She stepped into the room, barely able to find her voice. "Are you really leaving?" Raymond exhaled, gripping the edge of the suitcase. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to face her, his voice was steady but heavy with truth. "I don't know if I can get past this." The words hit her harder than any argument could have. She had expected anger, expected him to lash out, to finally spill out all the resentment he had been holding in. But this quiet uncertainty, it was so much worse. Tears blurred her vision. She didn't care about pride anymore. "I love you," she choked out. "I messed up. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. Just tell me what to do." For the first time in weeks, something flickered across his face. Hesitation, conflict, something other than emptiness. He was silent for a long time before he finally said, "You can't take back what you said. And I can't unhear it." Her heart sank. But then he added, "But maybe. I don't want to walk away. Not yet." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. And for now, that was all Daisy had left to hold on to. Raymond didn't leave that night, but the damage was still there. The road to healing would be long. And Daisy knew that some wounds wouldn't fade overnight. The real question was, could their love survive?